Hello Econ 151 students. This week in Lesson 12 we're going to be looking at Chapter 20, which is really one of the most important chapters in macroeconomics, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. In this chapter we're going to look at a few things that discuss economic fluctuations, and this time instead of looking at long run or classical economics like we did in the last lesson in Chapter 17, now we're going to be looking at the short run fluctuations and how that's impacted by changes in things like the money supply. So just to introduce the concept, one thing we do know about real GDP, or the amount that the economy produces in a year, that it grows at about 3% per year on average. And of course that's an average taken over many years of gathering this information. And in the short run, when we're looking at these fluctuations, we can see that GDP fluctuates around its trend being that 3%. So the trend is our average, and it's about 3%, but we know that there are fluctuations around that trend. And we're all familiar with this cycle. We call it boom and bust, or recession and inflationary cycles. So recessions are periods of time where the GDP is fluctuating below the trend. So if the trend is 3%, then in the short run, a fluctuation below the trend is referred to as a recession. So during a recession, as you probably are well aware, we have periods of falling income and rising unemployment. And so a recession would be something where the GDP is still growing, but perhaps at a rate of 1% or something significantly lower than our 3% trend. And depressions are very severe recessions, and they're rare because what is generally seen in a depression is not just receding or decreasing rates of growth, but actually times where there is negative growth or loss of GDP. So just to give those definition, short-run fluctuations are referred to as what we call the business cycle, or business cycles plural, meaning that we're constantly going through the phases of the business cycle. So this is a good graphic to understand a little bit about this fluctuation over time. So if you look at the bottom of this graph, you'll see that it measures time along the horizontal axis, and the shaded bars that you see here are time periods where we experience recessions. So this is real GDP, and it's done in what's called chained 2009 dollars. It's real GDP, so it's tied to 2009, and remember, real means that we've taken inflation out of it. So in real terms, here's what's gone on with the GDP, and you can see that these time periods are pretty familiar to us from our history, right? In the 1970s, we experienced a slight recession. In the mid-70s again, in the early 80s, in the the whole first part of the 80s, 1980 through about 1984, we saw tremendous economic problems. But you'll notice that overall the trend is upwards. So that's why we call this a trend line, and the fluctuations are moving around that trend. So in the shaded bars, you can see those are times when the growth dips a bit, or at least slows down, and overall you see the trend upward. So the first fact we want to know is that fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. Because I know that when we draw the model, quite often we draw this nice neat model that has pretty regular intervals. But it's important to know that that's just a picture we draw to understand it. It in no way represents the real change in growth. Economic fluctuations are not something we can predict. We do know that there will be fluctuations, but what they're going to be or how sustained they'll be is unknown. Another fact that we should know is that most macroeconomic quantities or measures or variables fluctuate together. So here you have an example of investment spending, and even though this is measuring a different variable, you can see that again you have a similar pattern. You have an overall trend that moves upward, and during the recessions, just like GDP dips during recessions, so does investment spending. And so those are variables that move generally together. Fact 3, tells us that as output falls, unemployment rises. So again, we can see this is the unemployment rate that's being measured here over time, over the same time period. And during the periods of recession, when output by definition is falling, look what happens to the unemployment rate. It is rising, and rather steeply over those time periods. So we can see there's a strong relationship between the output falling, GDP being output, and unemployment rising during those times of recession. So explaining the fluctuations is actually pretty complex and difficult, and the theory is controversial, and there are lots of different views on what might cause it and what the policy prescriptions might be. Most economists, to understand it, use the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and this is used to study short-run fluctuations. This is different from what we talked about before, classical economic theories that explain long-run behavior. So just to go back and remind you of what we looked at in the last chapter that we looked at, chapter 17, we looked at the classical dichotomy, which separates variables into two groups. We have real variables, which are quantities or relative prices, and we have nominal variables that are measured in terms of money, so they are on their face measurable. The neutrality of money is a theory that showed us that changes in the money supply will affect the nominal variables, but not the real variables, and that was a long-run theory. So most economists believe that the classical theory does describe the world in the long run, but it doesn't explain the short run. In the short run, the changes in nominal variables, like the money supply or the price level, can affect real variables, and we're going to see that with this aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. To study the short run, we're going to use this model, and here's our introduction to it. The model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now the good news is, in the short run, supply and demand are very similar to what you're already familiar with. So we're going to measure, since this is aggregated, we're going to measure the price level. So in a market for an individual product, the price for that product would be measured here. When we're talking about aggregating all of that into large-scale economic data, we're going to look at the price level. Real GDP is the quantity of output. So we denote that with a Y, and we're going to measure it in terms of real GDP, because remember, as a real variable, it's measured in terms of quantity or physical goods. We have an aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve is, again, just like the demand curve, there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity, and for many of the same reasons. However, since we're aggregating all of the markets in the entire economy, we just give it the name of aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is made up of C plus I plus G plus XN, our formula that gives us total GDP. In the short run, we have an aggregate supply curve, and it behaves very similarly to an individual market supply curve. And we call that the short-run aggregate supply because we're going to differentiate it from long-run aggregate supply. So this model helps us to see short-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate demand, but generally we just refer to them as AD and AS. The SR is just a distinction you'll find useful here shortly. So this model gives us an equilibrium price level. Just like we would see in an individual market, we can see where supply and demand come together to give us an equilibrium price level and equilibrium output. So the aggregate demand curve shows us the quantity of all goods and services demanded in the economy at any given price level. So just like a demand curve, we can see that it represents the combination of the price level and the output. The reason it slopes downward is because it represents this combination of all of the things that make up our real GDP, or Y in this case, and that is consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So we're going to assume that G is a fixed quantity because that's fixed by government policy. That's going to be fiscal policies in spending and taxation that determine the level of government expenditure. So to understand the slope of aggregate demand, we need to understand how a change in price along this vertical axis will affect consumption, investment, and net exports. So to understand the relationship between price and consumption, we're going to look at a few effects. The first one is called the wealth effect. Let's imagine that the price level rises. And so because of that, the dollars that people hold are worth less. Remember that relationship, that inverse relationship between an increasing price level and decreasing value of a dollar. So if the price level rises, the dollars that people are holding on to will buy less. So real wealth is lower and people feel poorer. And the result then is that consumption falls. So there's that inverse relationship that explains at least part of that downward sloping aggregate demand curve. As price goes up, consumption goes down. And we can reverse that and say as the price level goes down, consumption would increase. Just reverse this process. The interest rate effect, the relationship between the price level and investment. So let's imagine that the price level rises, and buying goods and services in that case is going to require more dollars. So to get these dollars, people are going to sell bonds or find some other asset that they can exchange for dollars. This is going to drive up interest rates, and as a result, investment falls. And this is something we covered in a previous lesson as well. The idea that interest rates are the cost of money. So if money costs more to use for investment, then investment is going to fall. And the reverse would be true as well. And so there's a negative relationship between the interest rate and investment. So I depends negatively, meaning in the opposite direction, on interest rates. And then the third part of the downward sloping aggregate demand curve that can be affected by changes in the price level is net exports. So let's imagine that the price level rises. With that increase in the price level, U.S. interest rates are going to rise, and that's due to the interest rate effect that we saw previously. As those interest rates are rising, foreign investors then are drawn to U.S. bonds because they're going to get a higher rate of return on that. In order to purchase those bonds, which are denominated in U.S. dollars, foreign investors are going to have to convert their money. So there's going to be a higher demand for dollars in the foreign exchange market. That higher demand for dollars is going to cause the U.S. exchange rate to appreciate. And what that means is that for people who are buying exports, that's going to cost more for them to get the dollars that they want. So the dollars are appreciating because of the high demand for them in the bond market. Now these more expensive dollars are going to cause people who would normally buy our exports, denominated in U.S. dollars, it's going to make them more expensive to buy. It's going to make imports to the U.S. cheaper because the value of our dollar relative to other currencies has gone up. And so we can buy more of other currencies, so we can buy the goods from another country cheaper to us. And so it benefits us in terms of imports, but it harms our exports. So if we think about this, net exports is exports minus imports. So if exports are going down and imports are going up, that decreases net exports, which is going to decrease aggregate demand because net exports is a component of aggregate demand. So again, there's that inverse relationship between the price level and net exports, which is one of the components of GDP. So the result in this case is that net exports falls as the price level rises. So the slope of the aggregate demand curve then can be seen in these four components, only three of which we can see changes in, one of which is established by government policy. So an increase in the price level reduces the quantity of goods and services demanded because that inverse relationship, price goes up, aggregate demand goes down, price goes down, aggregate demand goes up. And the reasons for this are, to recap, the wealth effect, consumption falls, the interest rate effects, or investment falls as a result, and the exchange rate effect, which causes net exports to fall. Now, reasons that the aggregate demand curve might shift are related also to those four components. So any event that changes consumption, investment, government expenditures, or net exports, except for a change in price, will shift the aggregate demand curve. And this should seem familiar to you because similar to a demand curve for an individual market, a change in price never shifts the curve. It only moves to a new point along the curve. The same is true here. So any of these four contributing components will shift the entire curve. A change in the price level will not. So here's an example. Stock market boom makes households feel wealthier. That wealth effect causes consumption to increase, and that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right because consumption is one of those four components. Another example, if there's a stock market boom or crash, either one will shift the curve because of the wealth effect. It just depends on which direction it goes. Preferences that people have regarding consumption and saving, the trade-off. Tax hikes or cuts, all of these will change consumption, either an increase or a decrease. Events that might change investment would be firms buying new computers, equipment, or factories. Investment by definition is businesses purchasing resources. Expectations about the future, either optimism or pessimism, will have an effect on how much people are willing to spend on investment. Interest rates, monetary policy, these are all market conditions that affect the level of investment. Notice that these are not changes in the price level. These are those outside market conditions that can have an effect on decisions within the market. Another thing that might change investment is the investment tax credit or other tax incentives. And changes in government spending, which are generally determined outside of the monetary market. These are government decisions. We call those fiscal policy. And this would be things like federal spending on perhaps defense, state and local spending on things that we all consume, roads and schools. Changes in net exports are going to be caused often by booms and recessions in other countries that we deal with, that we trade with. Their level of income will determine how much of our exports they're willing to bring in and purchase, and at the same time, what we're willing to buy from them has a lot to do with what's going on with their economy. Appreciation or depreciation of currency that results from international speculation in foreign exchange markets will also have an effect on net exports. So a little bit of practice here. The aggregate demand curve, what happens to that curve in each of these scenarios? So for A, a 10-year-old investment tax credit expires. B, the U.S. exchange rate falls. C, a fall in prices increases the real value of consumers' wealth. Or D, state governments replace their sales taxes with new taxes on interest, dividends, and capital gains. So if you go back to the things that will cause that curve to shift in either consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports, you can find the appropriate changes here. And just to go through these, if a 10-year-old investment tax credit expires, that means essentially that tax on investment will increase, and therefore investment's going to fall, and because now it's more expensive to borrow money to use for investment because that tax credit you used to get kind of as a rebate is gone, and so the aggregate demand curve would shift to the left because of a decrease in aggregate demand. If the U.S. exchange rate falls, net exports will rise and aggregate demand will shift to the right. And by the way, if you're wondering why that is, the exchange rate means that relative to the other currency, U.S. dollars are now cheaper. So if somebody in another country is able to get dollars cheaper, that's going to mean that they're more able to buy U.S. goods. That's going to raise our exports, which as part of GDP is going to cause aggregate demand to increase. A fall in prices increases the real value of consumers' wealth, and that wealth effect is going to actually move along the AD curve. This is not going to be a change. The curve itself will not shift because it's prices, right? The price level is not a shifter. So this is a little bit tricky, so watch out for that. So a fall in prices will make people feel wealthier, but it will not shift the curve. D, state governments replace sales taxes with new taxes on interest, dividends, and capital gains. And this is going to cause consumption to rise because the repeal of one tax puts the money back in the pockets of people. So if they're paying less essentially for goods, this is not a change in price. This is really a change in income. And so consumption will rise and aggregate demand will shift to the right. All right. So let's look at the aggregate supply curves. And they're plural because there are different ranges of it. So the curve in general shows the total quantity of goods and services that firms produce and sell at any given price level. This is aggregated for all of the goods and services produced within the economy. So aggregate supply is upward sloping in the short run, so that's why we draw the SRAS as this upward sloping curve. And it should look pretty familiar, like a supply curve that you've seen before in individual markets. And in the long run, it is vertical. So long run aggregate supply is indicated with this vertical curve. And we'll look at that in a little bit. The natural rate of unemployment and output are indicated here with this vertical long run aggregate supply. And we call it YN for natural rate of output. Now I said unemployment as well because when we're looking at the natural rate of output, the assumption is that the unemployment rate is also at its natural rate. And if you remember from a previous chapter, we talked about the natural rate of unemployment. That is where we have frictional and structural unemployment, but no cyclical. And we call that natural because frictional and structural are always going to be the case. There's no policy that can make those go away. So we call those natural. They're part of the economic movement and just life. And so where we're at the natural rate of output is also going to be where we're at the natural rate of unemployment. It's also known as potential output or full employment output. Another term that means natural rate of unemployment is full employment. You'll also see this referred to sometimes as Y star. Again, the notation is to indicate that this is the full employment of resources so that there's no unemployment, or at least no cyclical unemployment. And we're also producing at the potential. So if you go back and remember the production possibilities frontier, it's similar to being right there. This point on the production possibilities frontier tells us that all resources are fully employed and that we're producing at our maximum capacity. All right, so that's our long run. The reason the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical is because it's determined by how much labor, capital, natural resources, and technology, how much of that is available. What is our maximum production capacity? So again, it's just like being on the production possibilities curve. It is that maximum amount, and it gives us that limitation. An increase in the price level when we are operating at maximum capacity will not affect any of these resources. None of these inputs are affected by a change in the price level, right? So the price level affects outputs. It affects how much is demanded and how much is supplied. That's all the production that's made. That's why. However, a change in the price level has no effect on any of the inputs: land, labor, capital, technology. And so an increase in the price level won't affect any of these. So it does not affect Y or YN or Y star, whatever notation you want to use. And here we go back to that classical dichotomy, which we said was a long run outlook. The classical dichotomy, again, says that changes in the price level will not affect real variables. And this output is a real variable. It's measured in physical units of output. So here's our classical dichotomy coming back to us. We say that in the long run, a change in the price level has no effect on all of the components that make up the long run aggregate supply curve. And so an increase in the price level does not affect the output that is potential for the economy. Now, reasons that the long run aggregate supply curve might shift would be any event that changes any of those determinants of the long run aggregate supply curve. So, and the determinants we just said are the inputs of production. So, for example, immigration is a change in the marketplace. It's an underlying condition that would increase that input of labor. This is going to cause output, potential output, to rise. If we have more of a resource, then we have more potential. And so that might cause that shift to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve. Another reason, changes in any change in labor or anything that changes the natural rate of unemployment. So immigration, we already saw. Baby boomers retire. That's going to have an effect in the labor market. Right? It's going to remove a great number of workers from that labor market, so that would cause it to shift to the left. Government policies that reduce the natural unemployment rate, and we have a variety of policies that the government can enact in order to affect that. Changes in, K is notation for capital, and H is human capital. So again, those are the inputs that give us that Y star. And so changes that would shift the curve would be investment in factories or equipment. That would be changes in capital, physical capital. More people getting college degrees. That would be a change in human capital. And again, that changes the quantity or quality of resources, so that could very well shift that long-run aggregate supply curve. Factories destroyed by a hurricane is destruction of capital. And so all of those would have an effect. Changes in natural resources, again, one of those inputs into Y star. Discovery of new mineral deposits, a reduction in supply of imported oil. Any of these natural resources where we experience changes can change that Y star value. Changing weather patterns that affect agricultural production. And then finally, the last input, changes in technology. And these are widespread productivity improvements from technological progress and other such improvements in technology. So we can use these together to depict long-run growth and inflation. So we can put it all together and see how short-run and long-run work together. Over the long run, technological progress is going to shift long-run aggregate supply to the right. So in this picture, let's say we're going from 1990 to 2000, and then again to 2010. So we can see that consistent progress to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve. And let's say that growth in the money supply at the same time period shifts aggregate demand to the right. So we can say that the effects of the growth in the money supply are going to have an effect on aggregate demand, and it also shifts to the right. And what we can see as a result is that this ongoing inflation and growth in output are connected to one another. You can see that they move in the same direction. Now, the short-run aggregate supply curve, we can say, is upward sloping. And over the time period of 1 to 2 years, an increase in the price level causes an increase in the quantity of goods and services supplied. And it's as simple as that, right? Because the supply curve still has the same incentives built into it that we learned about in the individual market. As prices rise, market prices rise, the suppliers are more eager to put their product out there at higher prices. So an increase in the price level is going to increase the quantity of goods and services supplied. And that really explains that upward sloping supply curve. Now, why do we care about the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve? And here's why. If the aggregate supply curve is vertical, fluctuations in aggregate demand don't change this value, output or employment, right? So aggregate demand can shift to the right or to the left, and it's still going to be at equilibrium at this output level. And of course, remember that this also indicates the natural rate of unemployment. So we can see it graphically and notice that it always finds equilibrium at that same level of output. If aggregate supply curve slopes up, however, then shifts in aggregate demand will affect output and employment. So we can see it differently. So let's say we have the upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, and now we can see that with those changes in aggregate demand, you're going to have changes in output and employment. So notice that instead of being at the original, we're going to have changes in output and unemployment that are related to the new equilibrium point. So you can see that pretty well. There are three theories of the short-run aggregate supply curve, and in each we've got some type of market imperfection. So the result is that output deviates from its natural rate when the actual price level deviates from the price level that people expected. So we'll come back to that, but that's just kind of the rule that we're going to work towards with these three theories. So we're going to have a different output level from the expected if the actual price level is anything different than what people expected. So the first theory that explains this is the sticky wage theory. The imperfection that they're referring to in the market is that nominal wages are sticky in the short run, meaning that they adjust slowly to changes in the price level. And this has a lot to do with labor contracts and social norms. When there's changes in inflation or the price level, most firms don't rush right out and either increase or decrease wages. Now, one thing that's going to keep that from happening are contracts that are entered into. And we see a lot of that with labor unions. But social norms also say that when the economy takes a downturn, your boss doesn't just quickly and automatically cut your wage to adjust to it. Wages are very slow to respond, and because it just would be bad for morale and for business if wages just were that volatile. And also it'd be bad for families and stability in family life. So firms and workers set the nominal wage in advance based on expected price level and that what they expect to prevail. And so nominal wages are established with some foresight and consideration about what they expect to see. Now, if the actual price level is higher than the expected price level, that means that for the firm, revenue is higher, but the labor cost is not. So there's a period of time where your wages aren't keeping up with inflation, let's say, and the employer is more profitable. Production is more profitable, so firms enjoy that moment in time. They're receiving more in revenue, they're not paying out more in wages, and so they're profitable, so they increase output and employment. So what we see is that higher price levels cause higher output. And this is temporary. And so the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward because we're talking about that relationship in the short run between the price level and output. So here's our short-run aggregate supply curve. And so a higher price level encourages greater output because they're enjoying the benefits of those higher prices without paying the costs right away. The second imperfection in the market that explains this upward sloping supply curve is the sticky price theory. The imperfection is that many prices are sticky in the short run, and that word sticky just means sluggish and slow to adjust. And one of the main reasons that they're slow to adjust is that there are costs to raising prices. Businesses, even though the price level might be rising around them, businesses are not able to simply raise costs. It's actually a very costly undertaking to change prices. especially if it's a larger organization. And these menu costs would be the cost of adjusting prices. And so printing new menus, literally menus if you're a restaurant, the time required to change price tags, the effort that goes into, letting the public know about new prices is a very expensive proposition. So this is going to mean that price changes don't take effect immediately. There's a cost to be paid to that. And firms will know this. They understand that they are going to have menu costs if they try to raise the costs suddenly in the future. And so they set sticky prices in advance based on, again, their expectation of the price level. And so firms, when they're making plans, they consider very carefully what they expect inflation to be, what they expect the price level to look like. And so let's just do a little practice with this. Suppose that the Fed increases the money supply unexpectedly, and in the long run, we know that that's going to cause an increase in the price level. In the short run, however, firms without menu costs can raise their prices immediately, right? If you have some sort of process where you can just input the new cost into a computer and it goes out and it's done electronically, like a gas station, for example. The menu cost is very low to change their prices. So a firm like that would be able to raise their prices immediately. However, firms with menu costs wait to raise prices because it takes time and they've planned out ahead. And meanwhile, their prices are relatively low. And this is going to increase demand for their products. So those firms, and this is most firms, by the way, those firms increase output and employment. So again, we're explaining this upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. So why is it as the price level increases, so does short-run aggregate supply? Well, in the short run, the firms with menu costs have to wait before they can take on those changes in price. So those firms that are waiting on those price increases because of menu costs, well, for the time being, in the short run, they have an advantage. They have lower prices relative to the ones that can change their prices right away, and so they are going to be more profitable, and they're going to be able to hire more people and produce more output. And again, that's going to mean as the price level increases, their willingness and ability to produce is going to increase. So higher price level is associated with a higher output, and again, that is our second explanation for why that short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. The third imperfection in the market that explains this is the idea that firms may confuse changes in the price level with changes in the relative price of the products they sell. And so they make a mistake in understanding. So let's imagine that the price level rises above the expected price level, and a firm sees its price rise before they realize that all prices are rising. So they see their price going up. Remember, for the firm, that individual firm, they are incentivized by that higher market price. And so they're going to see their price rise, and this is before they're aware that there's an increase in the general price level. The firm might mistakenly believe that its relative price is rising, and because of this, they might increase output and employment. And again, we're explaining that relationship between increasing price level and short-run aggregate supply changes. So in this case, we've got that direct relationship. As the price level increases, the quantity of output increases as the firm mistakenly believes that relative prices are rising. So an increase in the price level can cause an increase in output, making the short-run aggregate supply curve upward sloping. What all three of these theories have in common is that when Y, or output, deviates from the natural rate of output, or Y star, which is full employment output, when the price level deviates from the expected price level. So if we put this into a formula, here's what we can see. That output, or Y, is equal to the natural rate of output plus some factor which measures the effect of this difference, the difference between the expected price level, and the actual price level. So we use this formula. We've got our natural rate of output. That would be our long run aggregate supply curve. So if you remember that, that's our Y star. Plus the difference between the expected price level and the price level and how much that affects. That's what this alpha is. This alpha is the amount of effect that this difference has on our overall output. So we can see that if we apply this formula, we can look again at what we're talking about here. The three theories tell us that in each case, the change in output is related to the difference between expected price level and actual price level. So we can see this in action here. If the expected price level is indicated here, when the actual price level is less than the expected price level, we can see that actual output is less than the natural rate of output. And that's really all this is telling us, is that there's a relationship between those two things. The expected price level, the actual price level, the expected rate of output, the natural rate of output. So putting this together, short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply tells us that the imperfections in these theories are temporary, because one will actually lead to the other. Over time, sticky wages and prices do become flexible. So the imperfection in the market of sticky wages and prices is not forever. It's a temporary condition. And they do become flexible and changeable over time. Misperceptions, those firms that are perceiving that relative prices are changing rather than actual price level, those misperceptions are corrected. And so in the long run, we have the price expectations are the same as the price level, and the aggregate supply curve becomes vertical. So we put those together because in the short run, we have those three imperfections that explain that aggregate supply curve. But remember, those imperfections are temporary. So in the long run, we end up with the long run aggregate supply curve. And so we can see it here together. In the long run, the expected price level is equal to the actual price level, and the actual output, or Y, is equal to the full employment or natural level of output. So in the long run, those two things become equal. Now, reasons that the short-run aggregate supply curve might shift. Well, everything that will shift the long-run aggregate supply curve will also shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. And so price expectations can also shift it. That's in addition to the factors that will shift the long-run curve. Price expectations will affect that. So let's say that price expectations rise. People expect there to be inflation in the future. And workers and firms planning for the future, knowing that the wages in the short run are going to be sticky, will set higher wages. And at each price level, production is less profitable because of those higher wages, and output falls. So the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. The long-run equilibrium can be seen in this model, where, again, we go back to that understanding that in the long run, expected price level is equal to the actual price level, and natural rate of output is equal to potential output, or the actual rate is equal to the potential rate. And unemployment, by definition, is at its natural rate. Now, economic fluctuations are caused by events that are going to shift the aggregate demand and or the aggregate supply curves. And we say curves plural because one that will shift either the short run or the long run aggregate supply curve. So there are 4 steps to analyzing these economic fluctuations. First, we're going to determine whether the event will change aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Next, we'll determine whether the curve will shift left or right. Third, we'll use the diagram, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram, to see how the shift changes output and price level in the short run. And then we'll use the aggregate demand and supply diagram to see how the economy moves from the new short run equilibrium to a new long run equilibrium. So let's take a look at some of these shifts. Let's say the event is a stock market crash. The first thing that's going to happen is it's going to, through that wealth effect, is going to affect consumption. Consumption, being part of the aggregate demand curve, is going to cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left, right? Because consumption is going to fall, people feel less wealthy, and aggregate demand will shift to the left. The new short-run equilibrium then is at B, and that brings the price level down, and it brings output down. So unemployment is going to be higher, and output will be lower. Now over time, what's going to happen is the expected price level will fall. People will come to expect lower prices from this. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right, because as prices fall, that also includes prices for production, wages, things like that. And so that's going to cause the aggregate supply curve to increase. This is a long-run situation where time has time to make everything flexible. So that increase in the aggregate supply curve will lead us to the new equilibrium point at C, and it will bring unemployment back to its original level. However, you'll notice that it leaves the price level at a lower point than where it began. Here's another look at a scenario that changed aggregate demand. And this was a big one, the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933. The money supply fell 28% due to problems in the banking system. And I know we're kind of all familiar with the crash of the banks, but what's interesting to note is that the Federal Reserve did exist at that time. The Federal Reserve was created in 1914, and they failed to act as a lender of last resort and to prop up the banks. And so the money supply fell as the banking system really collapsed. About 40% of all money in the banks just disappeared. Stock prices fell 90%, and so that has that wealth effect, and it affected investment, of course. So consumption and investment fell dramatically, and output fell by 27%, and the price level fell by 22%. The unemployment rate rose from 3% to 25%, and this is over that 5-year time period. So that's a big, big shift in aggregate demand, but you can see how each part of GDP is affected by this one event, series of events really. The second one is the World War II boom that in many ways saw the end of the Great Depression. This is from 1939 to 1944, and during this time period, again, components of GDP, government outlays rose from $9.1 billion to $91.3 billion. So a vast increase, and these were government expenditures on things. This wasn't just transfer payments. So that had a big, big effect on GDP. Output rose 90%. The price level rose 20%. Unemployment fell from 17% to 1%. We would consider that really overemployed. Everybody was working. So here's a chance to practice a little bit working with the model, and you're asked to draw the diagram for the U.S. economy starting in long-run equilibrium. Then, from there, let's assume that a boom occurs in Canada, and using your diagram, show the short-run and long-run effects on U.S. GDP, the price level, and unemployment. So here's our diagram in long-run equilibrium. And the boom in Canada is going to affect net exports, because what that means is that Canadian currency relative to American currency is going to be worth more. That means American dollars are cheaper to people in Canada, so they're going to be buying more of our exports. So that's in America, that's going to affect our net exports. That's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. It's going to increase aggregate demand. The short-run equilibrium then is at point B, which shows us that the price level is higher and output is higher as a result. Now over time, let's go to the long-run scenario. The equilibrium or the price expectations, rise, and the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. Remember, when prices are expected to rise, then over time there are